2 weeks ago, I made a video criticizing an announcement. Alibaba had put out a 2.4 trillion parameter model with no benchmark table, no model card, no license, no pricing, and the thing I said mattered most, no active parameter count. I ended that video by putting 5 specific things in public, the 5 items I'd need before anyone could properly assess this model. And I said on camera that if they turned up, that would be the system working. Alibaba has now published 25 minutes of reading 5,000 words and a table I'll be honest about. It took me a while to get through. So this is the accountability video. I published a checklist, there's now a document to score it against, and I'm going to go through all 5 in order and mark each one honestly, including the places where the honest mark means saying I was wrong. Here's the plan. First, what's actually in the announcement, the specifications, including the one number I said I'd ask for first. Then something I got wrong in the last video that I need to correct directly, and it's not a small detail. It's one of the central claims I made about this company's direction. Then, the scorecard, item by item. Then the part that matters most for anyone deciding whether to use this thing. What the benchmark table actually says when you read it properly. Because there are more than 80 benchmarks in that post, and a table that size is not a scoreboard, it's a map. There are places this model clearly wins. There are places it clearly loses. And there's a pattern in which places that tells you more than any headline. And then what's still missing, because not everything on my list got answered. Standards note, I'm going to quote figures from Alibaba's published table in this video, and I'll be explicit every time about who measured them. Let's go. What's actually in it? The headline specifications first. 2.4 trillion total parameters and 95 billion active. There it is. That's the number I spent 4 minutes on last time saying was the first thing I'd ask for, and it's in the second paragraph of their post. Roughly 1 in 25 parameters fires per token. Let me tell you what that actually means, because it's genuinely informative. 95 billion active is large, considerably larger than the models we've been discussing lately. DeepSeek's Flash model activates around 13 billion. Kimi K3 activates a tiny fraction of its total. 95 billion active means this is not built for cheap high-throughput serving. It's built for capability per token, not tokens per dollar. That's a legitimate design choice, and it's the opposite end of the spectrum from a Flash class model, and now that they've published it, you can reason about it. That's the entire argument for publishing the number. The rest, a 1 million token context window confirmed in their integration configuration. Multimodal, text and images in. It's built on the architecture of their 3.5 generation, and the API speaks both the OpenAI and the Anthropic protocols, with regional endpoints. There's also a reasoning effort control, 3 levels, with the highest as the default, which is the same pattern we've now seen from multiple frontier labs. That's quietly becoming a standard feature, and it's a good one. It lets you trade depth against cost per request, rather than switching models. Now the correction I owe you. In the last video, I said something quite firm. I said that Alibaba's best models had gone closed, that their open line continued only at smaller sizes, and my exact framing, that Alibaba's best models are now closed and their open models are no longer their best models. I built a whole section on that. I used it as the strongest available argument for downloading weights while you can, because the companies subsidizing OpenAI can change their minds. Alibaba has announced that this model's weights are being open-sourced, Hugging Face and Model Scope, and their stated timeframe is next week, and their post is explicit about the significance. This is the first time they will open-source the weights of a model at this tier. So the trend I described, flagship goes closed, open line shrinks, is, on this evidence, being reversed by the company itself. Not softened, reversed. Their most capable model is the one they're saying they'll open. I want to be precise about what I'm conceding and what I'm not. What I got wrong was the directional claim. I read 3 data points as a trajectory and stated it with more confidence than the evidence supported. That's a real error in reasoning, not a small factual slip. And it's the kind I most want to avoid, because a confident narrative is much harder for a viewer to check than a wrong number. What I'm not conceding is the underlying advice, which I'd give again. Weights on your disk cannot be revoked, and access that depends on a company's continued goodwill is not the same as ownership. That's true regardless of which direction any particular company is currently moving. And one thing that is still simply true, as I record this, the weights are not out. Next week is a specific, credible, dated commitment, considerably better than the undated promise I criticized last time, but it is still a commitment rather than a download. I'll believe the trend has reversed when the files are there. I fully expect them to be, I'm just not going to score a promise as a delivery because that's exactly the standard I'd apply if I dislike the conclusion. The scorecard. 5 items. Here's the honest marking. 1. A published benchmark table with methodology, delivered, and comprehensively. Not one table, 2. Running to more than 80 benchmarks across coding, agentic work, general capability, multimodal reasoning, documents, video, and spatial understanding. But the part that impressed me isn't the size, it's the 36 numbered methodology footnotes. They state which harness each model was run in. Temperature, top P context window. How many attempts were averaged? Timeouts. Which model acted as judge? Which figures came from official leaderboards versus their own testing? Where ground truth annotation errors were corrected. That is a genuinely high standard of disclosure, better than a lot of what I read from labs in every country. And it's the difference between a bar chart and a result you can argue with. Full marks, and I'm happy to say so. 2. The active parameter count delivered. 95 billion stated up front rather than buried. 3. A repository with a real license, dated commitment not delivered. Named platforms and a stated week. That's a meaningful upgrade on last time. It isn't a download. 4. Published per token pricing, still absent. The post directs you to their cloud platform for access, but there is no rate in it, which means the calculation every engineering team does before adopting a model. What does this cost us at our volume still can't be done from this document. Given how much else they published, this omission is conspicuous. 5. Independent evaluation, partial, and the nuance matters. Here's what they actually did. For several benchmarks, they take competitor scores from independent sources, an established evaluation service, an official public leaderboard, published system cards. That's genuinely good practice. It means they're not marking their rivals' homework. But their own model scores are their own testing, which is completely normal and not a criticism. Every lab does this on launch day, but it means the central claim is still self-reported. The independent verdict on this model doesn't exist yet. It'll take days to weeks, and it'll come from the same evaluation services they're citing for everyone else. So 2 clear passes, 1 dated commitment, 1 partial, 1 still missing. Against a starting point of 0 out of 5, that is a substantial change. And the right thing for me to do is say that clearly, rather than hunt for reasons to stay unimpressed. Now read the table properly. Here's where I can add something, because I don't think many people are going to read 80 benchmarks carefully. When you do, a clear shape emerges. Where it genuinely leads on a research replication benchmark, it posts the highest score in the table, above every competitor listed. On instruction following, it leads by a wide margin. On a broad search agentic task, it edges ahead of the top frontier model. It leads on health, legal, and finance professional benchmarks. On terminal-based coding, it comes in above both Anthropic models listed, though behind OpenAI's. And on computer use, operating an actual desktop, it takes the top spot. Where multimodal is concerned, it's not close. Across vision, video, document understanding, spatial reasoning, and KAD, this model wins repeatedly and sometimes by enormous margins. On several visual perception benchmarks, it's ahead of everything else in the table by 10 or 20 points. If your work is visual, documents, video, interfaces, design, engineering drawings, this is the strongest showing in that table by a distance. And where it clearly loses, on one software engineering benchmark, it comes last of the 4 models compared. And it's not marginal. On a hard general knowledge exam, it sits roughly 10 points below the leading frontier model. On another well-known software engineering benchmark, it's 12 points behind. On a frontier coding benchmark, 15 behind. So the honest summary is not a new bar, it's frontier competitive on agentic work, genuinely leading on multimodal and computer use, mid-pack on hard software engineering, and behind on the hardest reasoning. That's a real, useful, differentiated profile, and it's a far more informative thing to know than any single ranking. Which is the point of publishing a table. The headline said, a new bar. The table says something more specific and more interesting. The table is right. Why 95 billion active is the most consequential number in the post. Let me spend 2 minutes here because this number reframes everything else and almost no coverage will pick it up. Regular viewers know the split. Total parameters govern memory, active parameters govern speed and cost. A model with a tiny active fraction is cheap to serve and fast. That's why the Flash class models exist. A model with a large active fraction spends far more computation on every single token. Now place this one on that spectrum. 95 billion active is roughly 7 times what DeepSeek's Flash model activates. It is enormously more than the sparsest large models we've covered, where under 2% of the network is awake at once. So this model sits at the opposite end of the design space from everything else we've discussed this month. It is not optimized to be cheap. It is optimized to be capable per token, and when you read the benchmark profile with that in mind, it clicks the wins cluster in long horizon, multi-step, multimodal work, which is exactly what you'd spend a large active parameter budget on. 2 consequences worth holding. First, on cost. Without published pricing, you cannot model this, but the architecture is a strong hint. 95 billion active parameters per token is not the shape of a budget model. If you're planning high-volume automated work, that matters more than any benchmark in the table. Second, on running it yourself. And this is the counterintuitive one. When the weights land, a big active count makes this a worse candidate for the streaming techniques we covered this week, not a better one. Those techniques exploit sparsity. The smaller the piece you must hold at once, the better they work. A model with 95 billion parameters awake per token has a large streaming unit. The sparser models are the ones that fit on small hardware. This one won't, even after it's open, which is the honest tension in this announcement. The most capable model they've made is also the least reachable for individuals, and open weights don't change physics. What open weights do change is who can serve it, study it, fine-tune it, and build on it. That's still enormous. It just isn't the same as you running it on a desktop. The detail that changed my read most. There's something in that table I want to draw out, because it's the strongest credibility signal in the whole document and it's easy to miss. They published several in-house benchmarks, evaluations they built themselves. Normally that's a warning sign, because a benchmark you design is a benchmark you can design to win. They lose on several of their own. On their in-house software engineering benchmark, both Anthropic models score higher. On their in-house benchmark for their own coding product, both score higher again. On their React building benchmark, the top frontier model beats them. Think about what that means. They built the test, chose the tasks, ran the evaluation, and published the version where they come second. Nobody made them do that. They could have quietly dropped those rows and no one would ever have known. That single decision moves my confidence in the rest of the table more than any individual score in it. It's the difference between a document written to persuade and a document written to inform. I criticized this company 2 weeks ago for publishing a claim with no numbers. The right response now is to notice that they've published numbers that don't flatter them. The demonstrations, and the one you can actually go and check. The post spends most of its length on case studies rather than benchmarks, and they're worth walking through with the appropriate discount applied. A 16-day autonomous coding run. They set the model to build a command line project from an empty folder and keep improving it, taking community feedback and its own test results back into an engineering loop. Their reported figures: 265 commits, 127 pull requests, 151 issues over roughly 16 days of operation. And here's why this one is different from every other demo in the post. They published the repository. The full project trace is public. That means anyone can go and read the commit history, look at the pull requests, and judge the code quality themselves. A claim you can inspect is in a completely different category from a claim you can't, and I'd encourage anyone skeptical to go and look rather than take either their word or mine. A research paper reproduced, then improved. Given only a paper and some GPUs, no starter code, they report roughly 125 hours of continuous work, 7,600 lines of code, 33 rounds of GPU training. It reproduced the paper's findings, then ran its own improvement loop across 18 ideas and reported beating the paper's own method on a competition maths benchmark. A live competition entered into a real online contest against 526 human teams under a 24-hour limit, 45 submissions. Accuracy climbing from 0.6 to 0.85, finishing ahead of roughly 87% of the field. And a chip design. This is the one I found most striking. Starting from empty module templates, it produced a working hardware design and then optimized it across around 500 turns, from 8,200 gates down to 678. Their reported physical result: an 81% reduction in die area with timing closure achieved. Apply the standard discount. These are demonstrations selected by the company, and you're not seeing the runs that failed. But note the shape of what's being claimed. It isn't answers questions well. It's sustained, self-correcting work across hundreds of steps and multiple days. That's the capability the entire industry is currently racing toward. And it's the thing that would actually change how work gets done. What's still missing, and one thing to watch: being fair in both directions. Pricing is still absent, and it's the one item on my list with no movement at all. For anyone evaluating this commercially, that's the remaining blocker. Independent evaluation hasn't happened yet. Watch the public leaderboards over the next couple of weeks. That's the real test. And note that it's a test they've made easier to run by publishing their methodology in this much detail. And a genuine methodological caveat, disclosed by them but worth surfacing. Not every model in that table was run in the same harness. Their footnotes state that the Anthropic models were evaluated in one coding agent, OpenAI's in another, and the Qwen models in a third. On some benchmarks, they compare their own fresh run against competitors' best published scores from elsewhere. None of that is hidden. It's all in the footnotes, which is exactly why I can tell you about it. But it does mean small gaps between models should be read loosely. Harness matters. A 3-point difference across different harnesses is noise. A 15-point difference is a finding. Read the table with that filter and it gets more honest still. One more they disclosed and I'll pass on. A footnote notes that results for one competitor may involve fallbacks. That's them telling you a comparison may be imperfect, at their own expense. Again, that's a document trying to inform. Using it practically. 4 things worth knowing. It works with the coding agents you already use because the API speaks the Anthropic protocol. The documented path is to set 2 environment variables and point a Claude code install at it. There's a configuration for OpenAI's Agent 2 and for several open source harnesses. Base URL and key again. That single field remains the universal adapter of this entire ecosystem. and it's why switching models keeps getting cheaper. Use the reasoning effort control deliberately. The default is the deepest setting, which is also the most expensive per request. If you're doing something routine, drop it. That's a cost lever most people won't notice exists. For free evaluation, their browser chat interface. Today, no key. And from the routing registry I searched, there's a starter credit at one aggregator, though I'd point you at the first-party route for the reasons we always give. There's also a keyless third-party route that the registry itself tags as one to avoid, and I'd take that tag seriously. And on running it locally, because someone will ask, 2.4 trillion parameters at 4-bit is on the order of 1.2 terabytes. That is not a consumer machine, and it isn't a workstation either. Even when the weights land next week, this is a model for people with serious infrastructure, or for the streaming techniques we covered this week, where the 95 billion active count actually makes it a poorer streaming candidate than a sparser model, not a better one. So who is this actually for? 5 honest cases, because 80 benchmarks don't add up to a decision. If your work is visual, documents, video interfaces, drawings, this is the clearest recommendation in the video. The margins on document understanding, video reasoning, spatial tasks, and CAD aren't small. If you process 100-page reports, long video, or engineering drawings, go and test it this week. If you're doing agentic desktop or browser work, strong candidate. It leads on computer use benchmarks, and that's a category most models are still weak at. If you're doing hard software engineering, it's competitive but not the leader, and the frontier models it trails are ones you can already access. Test it, but don't switch on the strength of a headline. If you're on a budget and want throughput, be careful. 95 billion active parameters is a lot of computation per token. Without published pricing, you can't model the cost, and the architecture suggests this is not the cheap option. The Flash class models we've covered are built for that job. And if you want something you can own, wait a week. If those weights land as stated, the calculation changes completely, because then it isn't a service you rent, it's a file you keep. That's the single most consequential thing in this announcement, and it's the one part that hasn't happened yet. The honest limits. 4. 1. Every score in this video is Alibaba's. I've quoted their table because they published it with real methodology, and that's worth engaging with rather than dismissing. But I did not run these benchmarks, and neither did any independent party yet. Treat the whole table as a well-documented vendor claim, which is a genuine step up from an undocumented vendor claim, and still not the same as verified. 2. I was wrong about the direction of travel, and I've said so. If you watched the last video and took away Alibaba is closing up, please update that with the caveat that the files aren't out as I record. 3. The autonomous run case studies are impressive and unverified. Multi-day coding runs. A chip design taken from 8,000 gates down to under 700, a competition entry beating most human teams. Those are striking, and one of them points at a public repository you can go and read, which is more than most such claims offer. But they're demonstrations chosen by the company, and the base rate for cherry-picked demos in this industry is what it is. 4. This changes fast. Weights next week, independent evaluations shortly after, pricing whenever they publish it. Check current sources rather than trusting a video, including this one. Step back, because there's a lesson here that isn't about this model at all. 2 weeks ago, I published a list of 5 things. I got some heat for it, the general shape being that it's easy to demand documentation from the sidelines. Fair. But here's what a public checklist actually does. It makes you accountable too. I couldn't quietly stay skeptical because I'd written down in advance what would change my mind. When the document arrived, I had to go and mark it. And I'd rather do that than the alternative, which is what most commentary in this field looks like. Permanent, unfalsifiable skepticism about everyone, which sounds rigorous and costs nothing, because it never has to update. So they published the table, they published the active count, they published benchmarks they lose, they've committed to open weights at a tier they've never opened before, with a date. That's most of what I asked for, and it deserves to be said in the same tone I used for the criticism. The pricing is still missing, the independent evaluation hasn't happened, the weights aren't out yet. I'll cover all 3 when they land in whichever direction they land. That's the whole method. Say what would change your mind in public before the evidence arrives. It's uncomfortable, and it's the only thing that separates analysis from opinion. So here's my question, and I'll pin it below. What's on your checklist? Not for this company, for any model launch. What's the one thing that if a lab published it would move you from interested to convinced? Mine was the active parameter count, and I've now had the odd experience of getting exactly what I asked for. Tell me yours, and if this comment section can agree on a short list, that's a standard we can hold every lab to, which is worth more than any one video. And when those weights land next week, come back and tell me what you managed to run. That's the part I actually want to know. Every link, the full blog post so you can read the table yourself, their cloud platform, the model page for when weights arrive, the independent evaluation services to watch, and my original 5 checkables video so you can see what I said before I knew the answer, is in the description. Check my work, especially today. That's the standard here. The real explanation, sourced in plain English, with the corrections made out loud rather than quietly. If you'd rather understand the future than be sold it, subscribe. That's what we do every single day. I'll see you in the next one.